cold doesn't murder you outright. It peels away your dignity first, layer by layer, until what's left barely resembles a person. When Oakhaven cast Cora Higgins into the frozen maze of whispering pines, they weren't simply removing a neighbor. They were signing her death in ice. But the wilderness refused to oblige them. It reshaped her instead. The stench of scorched grain and blackened timber still saturated the October air. Sweet, nauseating, a perfume of ruin. The communal grain store, the single artery feeding that isolated mountain settlement, had collapsed into a smoking wound of ash and charred beams. Winter loomed less than 4 weeks out. Half the town's provisions were gone, and fear, when it reaches a certain pressure, always demands a throat to close around. Cora Higgins stood in the middle of that muddy square. Autumn wind lashed her auburn hair sideways across her face. 24 years old, fiercely self-reliant. Utterly alone since her father's death 2 winters back. Now ringed by the snarling, terrified faces of people she'd grown up beside. "I didn't do this!" Her voice splintered, throat still raw from the smoke she'd swallowed, trying to fight the blaze the night before. Mayor Thomas Ellis loomed on the meeting hall steps, gazing down with a face that could have been quarried from granite. He was pragmatic, he was ruthless, and he understood one thing with perfect clarity. If the town's fury turned toward him for never constructing a proper stone silo, blood would follow. He required a sacrifice. "Because you were angry, Cora." Mayor Ellis's voice rolled across the wooden storefronts like thunder. Quote 3, quote 4. Cora screamed it, wrenching against the coarse rope biting into her wrists. Then Sarah Jenkins emerged from the crowd, the baker's daughter, wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her eyes flicked away from Cora's gaze, then locked onto the mayor. Sarah said, a lie delivered in a voice shaking with manufactured terror. The betrayal hit Cora's chest like a fist cracking ribs. She understood the mechanics instantly. 2 days earlier, Cora had caught Sarah hauling sacks of flour from that same storehouse, hoarding for her own family. Cora had threatened to report her, so Sarah struck first, burned the evidence of her theft, and ensured the only witness would never speak again. "Sarah, tell them the truth." Cora fought against the iron grip of Arthur Pendleton, the town's broad-shouldered sheriff, pinning her arms behind her. Reverend Miller's voice cleaved through the crowd's murmuring like an axe through kindling. Banishment. The word settled over the freezing air, heavier than any coming snowfall. Banishment in late October meant the Whispering Pines, a sprawling, ancient boreal labyrinth stretching hundreds of miles in every direction. Dense, merciless, unnavigable. It was execution, just slower. Dressed in nature's indifference rather than a noose. They gave her no time to gather belongings. They didn't permit her to return to her small cabin. Arthur Pendleton pulled her heavy winter coat from her shoulders and dropped it into the mud. Community resources, they declared, belonged to the community. What remained on her body, a flannel shirt, worn denim trousers, leather boots, nothing else. At the final moment, Arthur, perhaps feeling some microscopic splinter of conscience, slipped her father's hunting knife and a small flint striker into her pocket. "May God have mercy on your soul, Cora," he muttered beneath his breath, pushing her past the heavy wooden gates of the village palisade. "Because the winter won't." The gates crashed shut. The iron bar dropped into its cradle with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Cora Higgins, severed from civilization entirely. She stood at the tree line, shivering so hard her teeth clicked together as the sun sank behind jagged mountain peaks. The shadows of those massive pines reached toward her, long, grasping, deliberate. Silence pressed against her eardrums, absolute, deafening in its completeness. Panic rose in her throat, sharp, metallic, suffocating. She looked back at the high wooden walls of Oakhaven. She caught the distant murmur of voices, the clink of metal on metal, the rhythm of a life that had sealed its doors against her. Tears threatened. She crushed them back. Frozen eyelashes would blind her. Wasted moisture would kill her faster. Quote, 12 __. Her father's training surged up through her like groundwater. Cora turned her back on Oakhaven and stepped into the dark, gaping throat of whispering pines. The first 48 hours collapsed into a single smear of raw physical agony and mental torment. Temperature cratered below freezing the instant the sun dropped. She walked until her legs turned to iron, driven by one animal imperative: shelter before frost. She found it on the second afternoon, a natural limestone overhang at the foot of a steep ravine, half blocked from the wind by a tangle of deadfall. She spent hours hauling dry pine needles, dead leaves, and moss into that crevice, banking them deep, a crude mattress to separate her body from stone that would leach every degree of warmth she had left. Her first fire was a war. Her hands were rigid, knuckles split and weeping in the brittle air. She peeled birch bark into tissue-thin curls, struck flint against the spine of her hunting knife. Sparks arced through the dark ravine. Died. Again. Died. She wept, tears crystallizing on her cheeks. "You'll die out here," a voice hissed inside her skull. "And Sarah Jenkins will sleep in a warm bed tonight." "No," Cora rasped into the emptiness. The word sounded alien, scraped hollow. "No." She struck again, full body behind the blow. A spark held. Birch bark hissed. A thread of grey smoke curled upward. She dropped to her knees, cupped herself around that ember like armor, fed it breath. Slow, steady, gentle. The glow spread. Red deepened. And then a single, perfect flame licked upward. She gave it twigs, then branches, until a roaring fire shoved the darkness back like a fist. Cross-legged before that blaze, her body convulsing as heat soaked into frozen marrow, Cora Higgins made a vow without sound. Whispering pines would not claim her. She would survive, and Oakhaven would learn the cost of throwing a woman to the wolves. The first month in those woods remade her entirely. The frightened girl shoved through the village gates died somewhere in the first week. What replaced her was leaner, harder, savage in its insistence on living. Hunger became a permanent resident behind her ribs. The forest in late autumn was closing down, sealing itself for deep winter. For 2 weeks, Cora survived on a starvation ration. She stripped shriveled rose hips from thorny stems, boiled pine needles in a hollowed chunk of hardwood, bitter tea that held scurvy at bay, cracked open rotting logs for pale, fat grubs. They tasted of soil and bile. She forced them down, knowing each calorie was another second on the clock. She understood quickly that the limestone overhang would fail her when true blizzards arrived. She needed real shelter. Armed with nothing but her father's hunting knife and bare hands, Cora began excavating a dugout. She chose a steep, south-facing dirt bank to catch whatever thin warmth the winter sun offered. 10 brutal days of digging. She gouged frozen earth with sharpened sticks, scraped soil loose with flat stones. Her fingernails cracked and bled. Every muscle howled. She didn't stop. When the hole was deep enough to stand in, she started felling saplings. Hours to hack through a single trunk with a 6-inch blade. She laid them across the dugout's mouth, wove them tight with supple willow. Over that wooden skeleton, she heaped 2 feet of pine boughs, dead leaves, then a dense layer of mud and raw earth. It froze solid by morning, an airtight, insulated shell. She shaped a narrow entrance, sealed it with a woven mat of pine branches. Inside, she carved a shallow fire pit and angled a chimney tunnel up through the dirt bank. Smoke out, heat trapped underground. The first fire she lit inside that dugout changed everything. The temperature climbed. The space was small, thick with the smell of earth and pine resin, but it was warm. It was hers. But warmth without food is just a comfortable place to die. Cora picked apart the fraying edges of her flannel shirt, twisting those stubborn cotton threads into crude snares. She'd watched her father build them 100 times, but watching and doing share almost nothing. She placed them along game trails. Then she waited. 4 days passed. Every snare came up empty. Her strength drained away hour by hour. Sleep stretched longer each time. The will to drag herself from that warm dugout into the knifing cold, it thinned to almost nothing. On the 5th morning, a sharp squeal split the silence of the forest. Cora clawed her way up the embankment, boots skidding on frost-slick moss. There it was, a big snowshoe hare, thrashing wild, caught by the throat in her makeshift loop. She didn't pause. Pity was a currency she couldn't spend. One quick snap of the neck, a whispered thanks to the forest. That night she turned the meat slowly over her small fire. Rich, fatty protein flooding her mouth, it hit like a sacrament. She kept every bone for broth, scraped the pelt clean, stretched it across a wooden frame to cure. She wasn't just clinging to life anymore, she was learning its language. 3 weeks deep into exile, the forest handed her something she hadn't earned. Cora had pushed into a ravine she'd never explored, hunting for late-season mushrooms. Wind tore through the upper canopy, screaming of an early storm. She picked her way down a steep, rocky grade, and the ground vanished beneath her boots. She crashed down slope, slamming into a heap of rotten, snow-crusted timber at the bottom. Spitting dirt, she wiped her face and studied what had caught her. Not just deadfall, a collapsed lean-to, an old trapper's camp, abandoned God knows how many seasons back. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. She tore into the wreckage with both hands. The wood was spongy, rotted through, crumbling at her touch. Under a canvas tarp that fell apart like wet paper, her fingers closed around something heavy and rust-caked. A hatchet. The handle was split. The iron head wore a thick skin of orange corrosion. But beneath that rust, an edge. Still there, still real. To Cora, it outweighed a solid brick of gold. Her hands trembled as she kept digging. A heavy cast-iron skillet emerged, a dented tin cup, and then a full spool of thick copper snare wire. Cora slumped against the ravine wall, pressed the hatchet to her chest, and made a sound caught somewhere between laughter and weeping. The equation had just rewritten itself. Over the following days, she worked a smooth river stone across the hatchet head, grinding away rust, honing the blade until it threw back light with a killing gleam. Firewood that once took hours now fell in minutes. She shored up her dugout walls, dropped heavier trees, built a proper drying rack for meat, and hung a solid wooden door where the flimsy pine mat had been. The copper wire gave her dozens of traps. Rabbits, squirrels, a fat grouse. She began stockpiling, smoking strips of meat over hardwood coals to hold through the weeks ahead. Bone needles and twisted sinew turned pelts into thick mittens, a lined hat, a heavy fur vest. The frail cast-off from Oakhaven was gone. What moved through whispering pines now was something closer to its apex predator. But the forest had only been letting her believe she was winning. It came on a late November afternoon. The sky, clear, piercing blue all morning, bruised over to the color of hammered iron. Temperature dropped so fast, Cora felt moisture crystallize inside her nostrils. A thick, smothering silence pressed down on the woods. No birdsong, no branch moving, nothing. Cora stood at the mouth of her dugout, face tilted toward that dead sky. She'd seen this before, back in the village. The signature of a whiteout. A monstrous blizzard capable of burying the world under feet of snow in hours. Temperatures crashing to 40 below zero. Quote _ 17, __, she whispered upward, pulling her fur collar tight against her throat. Her eyes were steady, sharp, already calculating. Quote _18, __. The next hour was pure controlled fury, hauling armload after armload of split firewood into the dugout, packing every gap, filling every spare inch with fuel. She hauled the frozen meat inside and drove the heavy wooden door shut behind her, slamming the thick beam into its bracket. Darkness swallowed the room. Outside, the first flakes drifted down, gentle, almost lazy. Within minutes, that gentleness died. Snow came sideways, a screaming white wall. Wind clawed at the earth above her dugout like something trying to get in. True winter had arrived. It came to scour the forest clean of anything too soft to endure. Deep below ground, Cora Higgins fed her fire. Flamelight jumped in her eyes. She was warm. She was sheltered. She was fed. While the storm tore at the world above, her mind turned to Mayor Thomas Ellis, to Sarah Jenkins, to all of Oakhaven. They'd thrown her out expecting her to die, trusting their village walls to shield them from whatever came next. But Cora understood what they didn't. Their grain store was ash. A storm this savage would pin them inside with empty shelves and dwindling supplies. Oakhaven's people were the ones in true peril now. Winter had landed, and the balance of survival was shifting. The blizzard screamed for 4 relentless days. Inside her underground chamber, hours bled together. Cora tracked time by 2 measures only: the shrinking woodpile and the deepening hollow in her gut. She rationed brutally, gnawing small leathery strips of rabbit jerky to make every ounce last. Above her, the wind didn't blow. It shrieked, a thin metallic wail that travelled through frozen soil and lodged in her teeth. When that shrieking finally died on the 5th morning, the silence that replaced it pressed down like a physical weight. Cora lifted the beam from her door and pushed. Nothing. The door refused to move. Panic stabbed through her chest, instant and sharp. Buried alive. She seized her wooden shovel and attacked the narrow ventilation shaft overhead, smashing through plugs of compacted ice until one blinding needle of sunlight punched through the dark. 2 hours of savage digging followed, carving an angled tunnel upward through 4 feet of dense snow. When she finally broke the surface and dragged herself out, whispering pines had vanished. In its place, a blinding white ocean stretched to every horizon. The dark, brooding forest was gone, buried beneath drifts. Cold hit her like a wall. 30 below zero, easy. Yet overhead, the sky burned a flawless, crystalline blue. Cora buckled on the rough snowshoes she'd woven from willow and sinew during the storm's long hours. Her snare lines needed checking. The blizzard would have driven animals into shelter, and she needed fresh fat, desperately, to replace the calories she'd burned. 2 miles from camp, moving along a ridge above a frozen creek, she spotted it. a single flash of unnatural crimson against the white. Cora dropped flat. Her hand found the hatchet handle at her belt without thought. She held still, watching her own breath hang in the air. Nothing moved. She crept forward, snowshoes whispering against the crust. The crimson sharpened into a torn scrap of wool, caught on a shattered pine branch. Beneath it, half swallowed by a drift, a large mound. A few hard kicks cleared the loose powder. A frozen boot appeared, then a leg in coarse denim. She fell to her knees and clawed at the snow with her mittens, uncovering two ice-glazed faces. The first was a boy, 17 at most. Lips a hideous blue, eyes shut. She knew him at once. Toby Jenkins, Sarah's younger brother. Beside him lay Sheriff Arthur Pendleton, his thick beard frozen solid against his chest. Neither man responded. Both had slipped into the final killing stage of hypothermia. An hour remained, maybe less, before their hearts simply quit. Leave them. The feral, winter-hardened voice in her skull spoke first. They belong to the town that threw you into the woods to die. Let the forest collect its debt. She stared at Arthur Pendleton's rigid, frost-bitten hand. She remembered her father's hunting knife sliding into her pocket on the day of exile. That quiet, treasonous act of mercy had kept her alive. Cora swore, loud, raw, her voice cracking the perfect silence around her. She could not walk away. If she let the cold carve the compassion out of her, then Oakhaven had truly killed the woman she'd been. Working with furious precision, she hacked thick pine boughs and lashed together a rough travois. She dragged the unconscious men onto the frame, binding them down tight with her copper wire. She grabbed the drag ropes and pitched forward, letting her thighs absorb the punishment. 250 pounds of dead weight through knee-deep snow. Pure agony. Every fibre screaming. Her lungs filled with what felt like powdered glass, but she would not stop. By the time she reached the dugout, the sun was bleeding out along the horizon. Purples like bruises, oranges like open wounds. She hauled them down into the earthen warmth of her shelter, stripped the frozen stiff clothing from their bodies, wrapped them in the thickest furs she owned, and stoked the fire until that tiny underground room became a furnace. She melted snow, threw in dried herbs and the last of her fatty grouse meat, forced drops of scalding broth past their cracked lips. 12 hours of relentless nursing before Arthur finally opened his eyes. He stared at the dirt ceiling, then the crackling fire, then the wild, fur-draped woman working a cast-iron skillet. "Am I in hell?" Arthur rasped, his voice like sand over stone. "No," Cora replied, flat and hard. "You're in my house." Over the next 3 days, as Arthur and Toby clawed back their strength, the truth of Oakhaven's collapse poured out into that warm, earthen air. The village was dying. The blizzard had buried them, and without the communal grain, starvation moved with ruthless speed. But the cold wasn't the true poison. The mayor was. Thomas Ellis had declared martial law, confiscating private food stores under the banner of fair rationing. The reality, he was hoarding for himself and his loyal council dogs. "Sarah broke," Toby whispered one evening, tears carving lines through the soot on his face. "When the mayor cut our family's rations to a quarter loaf a day, she couldn't carry the guilt anymore. She stood up in the meeting hall, confessed everything. She told them she burned the storehouse to hide her own theft. She told them you were innocent." Cora felt something hollow open inside her chest. Vindication, but the wrong kind. "And the mayor?" "Locked her up," Arthur said bitterly, blistered hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot tea. "Called her hysterical from hunger. He knew the moment he admitted he'd exiled an innocent woman, that town would hang him from the rafters. Toby and I slipped out to hunt, hoping to bypass Eris entirely. The storm caught us instead.